have, at this particular time, 2 members of the city council, so we'll have a few more showing up. We have our city manager and we have our attorney. And then if you're looking out, we have strategic partners from the community representing economic development, tourism, and the chamber. And then we have department heads along the side. And so I think we've got a bigger audience than we've ever had before, but we felt this is really critical for us to, as we go through the findings of the survey, to have those partners around the table. So again, it's after 4 o'clock, and I think we start and know that others are going to be meeting and coming in throughout, but we'll turn the time over to you.
Great, thanks so much. I'm glad to have such a large audience. I feel honored, and I think that the survey we've done for McMinnville is a great tool, and I'm really glad to hear that so many stakeholders are there. One second with my slides. There we go. There we go. All righty. I think we've got our technical issues worked out. If you can't hear me at any point, just let me know. Just to briefly give you a little bit of history about my firm, National Research Center, or NRC, as we refer to it here. We have been conducting surveys for local governments across the nation for over 20 years. The principals of our company literally wrote the books on citizen surveying, and we have a long-term partnership with ICMA, the International City and County Management Association, and we're also charter members of the APOR Transparency Initiative. APOR is the American Association of Public Opinion Research. We do like our acronyms here at National Research Center. The survey that we conducted for McMinnville is the National Citizen Survey, or the NCS, as we refer to it. And broadly, the NCS is designed to be a somewhat standardized turnkey survey that enables us to measure overall community livability in individual communities. And the level of standardization for the NCS allows us to, in addition to giving you your results and your comparison data over time, it also has enabled us to create benchmarks for each of the standardized questions on the survey, which helps put your results into context. And I'll get a little bit more into those benchmarks as we go forward. And we've done the NCS in partnership with ICMA since 2001 in about 400 communities nationwide, including many in Oregon. When looking at overall community livability, we've broken it out into these 8 general facets that you see here. And if you've had a chance to review the reports, or when you do, you'll see that we've arranged the reports around these 8 facets of community livability and how they contribute to the quality of community overall. And I'll get more into these in detail as well. This is the second time we've conducted the NCS for McMinnville. The first survey was conducted in 2011, and this past survey was conducted in the fall of 2016. It's a scientific sample we randomly select 3,000 households within the city limits, and we've also broken those responses out by McMinnville's 3 wards. McMinnville received 831 completed surveys from households, which gives us a response rate of about 29%. That's well within the average response rates that we typically see for this kind of survey, and it's on par with the 2011 response rate as well. The overall response rate for this survey is plus or minus 3 percentage points. And the NCS, basically, we have a standard basic service package and then a menu of add-on options that the city can choose from if they'd like to augment some of the services that we offer as part of the standard package. So those are those boxes you see here on this slide. McMinnville chose to expand the sample to 3,000 households, which helped lower the margin of error. Typically, we mail to 1,500 households as part of the basic service, which gives a higher margin of error. So McMinnville opted to make sure that you had an even tighter margin of error, which is excellent. You also chose to have an open-ended question. So in addition to some of the customized questions on the survey, there was also a question where respondents could write in their own answers in their own words, and we'll get more into detail about that as well. The survey was a mailed survey, but respondents also had the option to complete it online if they preferred. There was also the option to complete the survey in Spanish. And as I mentioned, we broke the data out by McMinnville's 3 wards as well. I won't go into too much detail about that tonight, but that report does exist, and it's a great way to dig deeper into the results to see if there were any differences among those 3 wards in the way that services were rated, different community characteristics, and so forth. This next slide gives you kind of an overall sense of our extremely large national benchmarking database. We have about 600 communities of all sizes and types of local governments across the nation in our benchmarking database, and that has allowed us, as I mentioned before, to create an average rating for each of the standardized questions on the survey, which helps put your results into a richer context. Here's an overview of how McMinnville's rating stacked up to that national benchmarking database. We have intentionally made it very difficult to be higher than the benchmark or lower than the benchmark. And the reason behind that is to try and help make your data as actionable as possible, and areas where you're higher than the benchmark should truly be areas where you're truly excelling. They should really be considered areas where you're excelling. And areas where you're lower than the benchmark could be areas to focus potentially additional resources depending on your goals and community identity. So it's not a surprise here. It's what we expect and hope to see. It's a positive thing that most ratings were similar to the national benchmark comparison in McMinnville. The 3 items that were higher than the national benchmark were ratings for McMinnville's vibrant downtown and commercial area. And also McMinnville as a place to visit was rated much more highly than what we typically see in comparison communities. And a lot more of your residents recycled than residents in comparison communities. Some of the items that were lower than the benchmark had to do with housing, availability of affordable quality housing, and variety of housing options. And those are some of the things that we're going to see continue on as somewhat of a theme among these results. These arrows show you how the 2016 survey ratings compared overall to the 2011 ratings. And again, we would expect to see that most of the ratings remain stable over time. Typically, we don't see huge swings in resident opinion from survey administration to survey administration. But of course, it's important to note where we do see differences. So in McMinnville, we did see that a majority of the ratings remained stable from 2011 to 2016. 13 were trending up over time, and 19 were trending lower. And when we're looking at the ratings over time, we're using a higher margin of error than we use for the individual year's results. So what we consider to be statistically significant differences is if there was greater than a 5% change in the percent positive ratings for each item on the survey from 2011 to 2016. Some of the items that increased over time had to do with employment opportunities, cultural and arts and music activities, some related to mobility like street repair and street lighting, land use planning and zoning, that sort of thing. Some of the items that were trending down over time I'll also get into in a little bit more detail, but had to do again with affordable quality housing, housing options. Here are those 8 facets of community livability again. And this honeycomb chart you see here shows those 8 facets, and it's also showing in relation how those facets look for McMinnville. So in your instance, they're all that kind of medium blue color, which means that overall ratings in each of those 8 facets tended to be similar to the national benchmark. That's a positive thing. Those gold stars you see relate to a question we ask on the survey. We ask residents how important it is, if at all, for the McMinnville community to focus on each of these 8 facets in the coming 2 years. And McMinnville residents identified safety and economy as the top 2 most important facets. That's not uncommon. Typically, that's what we see in most communities when we ask residents about stated importance. Those do rise to the top. Doesn't make them any less important, of course, but just wanted to note that that's not an uncommon thing that we see. Now I'm going to go into the key findings from the survey data. If you had a chance to look at the community livability report, these are the summary statements we make at the end of the report that really reverberate through all of the survey data. Of course, there's really a lot of data, as you may have gotten the chance to see, and I don't want to keep you here too long, and I also want to make sure there's plenty of time to answer questions. So I'm going to give you an overview of these key findings. And the first is that McMinnville residents enjoy a very high quality of life. Most of the questions on the survey are asked on a scale of excellent, good, fair, or poor, and these pie charts depict the percentage that rated the overall quality of life in McMinnville and McMinnville as a place to live as excellent, good, fair, or poor. You can see the vast majority gave excellent or good ratings to both of these aspects of community life. These ratings both remained stable from 2011 to 2016 and were similar to the national benchmarks. When looking at some different aspects of community characteristics, at least 3/4 of McMinnville residents gave excellent or good ratings to their neighborhoods, the overall image of the city, the overall appearance of the city, and McMinnville as a place to raise children. These ratings were very positive. They were all stable over time and also similar to the benchmark comparisons. We also asked residents how likely they would be to recommend living in McMinnville to someone that asked, and how likely they would be to remain in McMinnville for the next 5 years. And at least 4 in 5 respondents were very or somewhat likely to both recommend living in the city and to remain in the city, and these ratings were similar to the benchmarks. The next key finding, back to that honeycomb again, that safety facet with the star, that residents identified safety as one of the top priorities for the community. When looking at the overall feeling of safety in McMinnville, about 3/4 rated that as excellent or good. The 2016 survey was the first time we asked about the overall feeling of safety in the community. So we don't have a rating to compare it to from 2011, but it is similar to the national benchmark comparison and what we typically see in other communities across the US. We asked residents to rate their overall feelings of safety, both in their neighborhoods and in McMinnville's downtown or commercial areas. And at least 8 in 10 gave ratings of feeling very or somewhat safe in their neighborhoods and downtown. These ratings were similar to the benchmark comparison, but I did want to mention that ratings for safety downtown have decreased somewhat from the 2011 survey. When looking at ratings for safety services, overall, they were rated as excellent or good by a majority of respondents, and they tended to be similar to the benchmark. You can see at the top of this list here, ratings for fire services and ambulance or EMS services, about 85% giving excellent or good ratings to each of those, and about 7 in 10 giving excellent or good ratings to both fire prevention and police services. A little more than half to crime prevention. However, this rating was lower than the benchmark comparison and was trending down slightly from the 2011 survey. The next key finding is that the economy was also deemed as one of the most important things by residents for the community to focus on. And overall ratings within this facet tended to be very positive. As I mentioned previously, this was an area where McMinnville had some of those ratings that were higher than the national benchmark. McMinnville as a place to visit and vibrant downtown area were both rated as excellent or good by at least 7 in 10 respondents, and these ratings were higher than what we typically see in other communities. So definitely an area where McMinnville where residents think the city is standing out. Ratings for the overall quality of businesses and services, the overall economic health, and McMinnville as a place to work were also rated positively by a majority of respondents, and these were similar to the benchmark. You can see that fewer than half gave excellent or good ratings to the cost of living or employment opportunities. However, those were both similar to the national benchmark, while ratings for shopping opportunities were lower than the national benchmark. Overall, ratings for employment opportunities increased from 2011 to 2016 by a pretty significant amount. And not shown on this slide were ratings for overall economic development services. Those were similar to the benchmark, but also increased by quite a significant amount from 2011 to 2016. Another economy-related question we ask on this survey has to do with personal economic outlook. We ask residents what impact, if any, they think that the economy will have on them and their family in the coming 6 months. And you can see that this rating, while it's 25% said very or somewhat positive, it's quite a significant jump from the 2011 rating. So that has gone up, and that is similar to rates we see in comparison communities across the nation as well. The final key finding is that while ratings for built environment were strong, there's definitely room for improvement. And you can see with some of these aspects of built environment, a majority gave ratings to public places where people would like to spend time, to the overall built environment of McMinnville, and to the quality of new development in McMinnville. And these ratings were similar to the national benchmark comparison. You can see that ratings for housing options and affordable quality housing, as I touched upon somewhat before, were lower than the benchmark. And these ratings also decreased over time. So that's definitely kind of a common theme we're seeing in the data here. One of the benefits of the NCS is that while many of the questions on the survey are fixed and standardized, there is that opportunity to ask questions that are completely specific to the city. And this is one of the questions that McMinnville chose to have that was unique to the city, but it seemed to fit in here with what we're talking about with the built environment and theme around housing. So this question asked residents how much they would support or oppose increasing the density of housing through apartment, condo, or townhome developments in the city in order to increase housing options. And about 70% said that they strongly or would somewhat support increasing housing density. So that could be a potential solution to some of these issues that are coming to light. For the final section here, I'll focus on the other custom questions that were specific to McMinnville on the survey. The next was a question about city priorities and asked residents how much of a priority, if any, it should be for the city to address each of these items over the next 5 years. And those were asked on a scale of high priority, medium priority, or not a priority. You can see that lightest color there is the not a priority. And you can see that at least a majority indicated that each of these items was either a high or medium priority. So they were all deemed very important by residents, but you can see that improvements to city streets and sidewalks, upgrades to public facilities, and availability of affordable housing come out on top. Down at the bottom is improvements to arts and cultural facilities and downtown improvements. However, it's still a majority indicated that they're at least a medium priority. The next question was a multiple response question. So we asked residents of this list that you see here, which of the following projects would you potentially be willing to fund with additional taxes? And please select all that apply, all that you would like to select. So that's why these numbers here don't total 100%. And you can see that up at the top of the list are street and traffic improvements, police services, increasing affordable housing, fire and ambulance services, and further on down the list, one of the options was none of the above, and as you can see, about 16% selected that. The next custom question asked residents about information sources and how they got information about the city government and its activities, events, and services. You can see this scale is major source, minor source, or not a source, and about half or more rated each of these as at least a minor source. And you can see at the top of the list here, about 90% rated local media outlets as at least a minor source, followed by word of mouth. The Parks and Recreation brochure or water bill were also very popular, as was the city website. The final evaluative question on the survey is that open-ended question I mentioned several slides back. And that was where residents can write in their own answer on the survey. So you've got a standalone report that details this in a couple of different ways. We looked at each response as it was written on the survey and categorized those responses into themes to try and help summarize for you the main themes that residents were bringing up in these responses. And then we've also broken them out and organized them by that theme, but showing you exactly each verbatim response as it was written on the survey so that you can read each response in their residents' own words. So the question was, what single community need or issue would you like the City Council to prioritize in the next 5 years? Coming up towards the top of that list were items related to infrastructure, like fixing city streets and sidewalks and improving streets. Issues related to safety. A lot of residents mentioned hiring more police officers. Safety and gang-related issues came up as a theme residents mentioned. And then close third was items having to do with health and human services. There were a lot of mentions of homeless people, perhaps increased homeless population, or at least a perception of that, and the desire to see that addressed and potentially have some more resources for homeless folks. A close fourth, not on the slide, also had to do with affordable housing. So that did keep coming up, as I've mentioned. So in conclusion, it's very apparent that McMinnville residents enjoy a high quality of life in the city and think it's a great place to live. Those are very strong positive ratings, and they have remained stable from 2011 to 2016. Both safety and economy were identified as top priorities by your residents. And also ratings for the built environment, while many of those are very strong and positive, they do show room for improvement, potentially, especially in the areas that may have to do with affordable housing or variety of housing options, as many of the questions on the survey addressed and as a lot of the data revealed. Moving forward, we always just like to give you a general call to action. It's our hope that this survey will help inform some of your decision making, be considered one piece of the puzzle. It's certainly not the end all be all. You've got a lot of decisions to make, and but hopefully it's a good tool to have in your tool chest. And I think hearing that you have such a large audience there today, and that there's elected officials and staff and other community stakeholders there, I think is a great start. So now I'd love to open it up to questions and talk about anything that you might want to know more about.
Thank you for the slide presentation. There's so much data that sometimes it's kind of nice to be able to get the larger overview. But I think what I'd like to do initially is maybe open it up to our stakeholders. I look at tourism, I look at business development and economic development, and that's who we have here. Any thoughts or questions that are specific maybe to your areas of expertise that you'd like to delve into? Again, we've got the report that's here, but I'll just open it up to our stakeholders first. And Jody, go ahead and come up to the mic so they can hear and we can record it. And
thank you.
Why don't you introduce yourself so that Dama may know who's speaking?
It's all weird, like I don't know where I'm supposed to be looking. I'm Jody Christensen. I'm the Executive Director for the McMinnville Economic Development Partnership. We are the one-stop business development office for the city of McMinnville.
I'm Joya Goodrum, the CEO of the Chamber of Commerce, and we help business. We do a lot of things.
we do a lot of things. We wear many hats. I think this is particularly important for us, the data that you've provided and the work that's been done around this. We recently announced an aspirational goal for our community of 1,500, not 1,000, 1,500 jobs in 15 years. That'll be our 150th anniversary. So we're in the data collection mode right now and really trying to figure out the best way to support an environment that grows those family wage jobs. So some of the data that you've provided really backs that up, particularly around housing. And we're looking at, from affordable to attainable housing in all different sizes and shapes. So that was really interesting to see that aspect of it. Again, I think we're a community that sort of enjoys space. And so growing up is sometimes a challenging aspect. But I will say that our downtown corridor, the Alpine District, or the Alpine Avenue and the Granary District are all areas that we see great potential in exactly what you said, that people want to have that different kind of housing mix. We're also really exploring the live, work, play concept of people want to be in a walkable place where they're working and they can access restaurants, but it still is a place where they can live. So that's good to see that there's some appetite for maybe different ways of looking at housing. That's going to be a big part of attracting and keeping talent in our community. We have to have a variety of housing mixes in our community to be able to really deliver on that promise of a accessible workforce for the companies that we've been talking to. So.
A thought that I saw is that, if I'm not mistaken, there was a increased perception between 2011 and 2016 in our economic outlook and the growth, and I think that speaks volumes to some of the efforts that have been going on and us telling the story. The other aspect of that is the homelessness and the affordable housing, and I can look down to Remy and kind of smile because we've got some good things happening. We're addressing that, but I just think that this kind of a survey really kind of from a higher view gives a sense of what is perceived out in the community, and I'd say we just need to keep this up, but we've got much more focus today than we did in 2011, so I get real excited about what the next survey is going to show in that area.
Well, it's nice, too, because a lot of the work that we do is we talk about quality of life, but everybody talks about quality of life. This backs it up. This says that our citizens agree that they have a higher quality of life here, and this is research that shows that. I did have a question, and I don't know if you can get into the detail. At one point, you said there was an increased or positive perception of economic development services. What kinds of things are included in that terminology?
It's a very broad item on the survey, actually, and it is just worded as economic development services. Okay. So, you can see some of the other aspects of economy and some of the other kinds of ratings on the survey, but that one is just worded that way as economic development overall, and that's how it was worded in 2011 too. So the wording stayed consistent. So, whatever bucket residents are putting that into, they certainly think it has improved.
Okay, great, thank you.
But I do think that goes to telling our story. I mean, the more and the better that MEDP and the Chamber can tell the story of what they're engaged in, people perceive that. And it may be only one instance they've heard something positive on the front page, 1,500 jobs in 15 years, but that sticks with them. And so I think telling the story, and then for our stakeholders that get reports from both of those entities, your entities, really helps us in doing what we need to do. So telling the story, I think, for all of us is really, really important.
Mm-hmm. Thank you.
Joya?
Yeah, I'll be really brief. I believe that the survey echoed lots of things that we already knew regarding affordable housing, regarding the fact that we do have really great jobs here, and it is a tight labor market. Our businesses tell us that all the time. So I don't think that there was anything surprising in it. And I was excited to see how positive, only being here for 7 months, it was great to realize that everybody knows what I already know after being here for just a short time. So,
yeah. Well, that's one of the uniquenesses of a survey. It really gives us, we kind of know we think we know what we don't know, or we do know, and this can kind of help us tremendously in focusing the council and the staff and our partners. And I think there's some glaring things that have come out this time that we knew we had to address, and we're doing that. So I think we're ahead of some of that a little bit. Any other questions from our partners?
No?
Okay, come up, Jeff, and
Hello, I'm Jeff Knapp. I'm the executive director for Visit McMinnville. Are we looking at each other, or are you just hearing me?
I just can hear you.
Okay, good. So I just want to know. So the data is, we're focused on creating economic development through the promotion of McMinnville as a year-round overnight destination. So really focusing on telling the story to get people to visit. And then hopefully once they do visit, they decide that this is a lovely place and they want to come and buy homes, which it looks like we currently are. We have some room to grow there. Question about the visit numbers of the perception of visit numbers being relatively high as a good place to visit. What is the national benchmark that you're comparing those to? How are we performing nationally? And is there any connection between other communities that have they're a nice place to visit, but they have low inventory for housing?
Yeah, I think that can be a common thread for sure. And, in some ways, some of these housing issues that are coming up for McMinnville, lack of variety or lack of, affordable, quality housing can be symptoms of success. As the economy has improved and economic development has improved, and those ratings have increased, and personal economic outlook has increased, things have also gotten more expensive, and perhaps more people have, moved to the city as a place becomes more desirable. It presents other challenges. So I think that's all tied together. As far as the actual benchmark and for a place to visit and how McMinnville compares, I can do a little more research into that for you. We do have in the technical appendices. I can pull up your ranking really quickly nationally. And while we did national benchmarks for McMinnville as part of the standard basic package, we can also, there's other ways of slicing and dicing the database because it's so large. So that might be something, if you want to examine that further, that we could look at. But let me just see here.
I don't mean to put you on the
McMinnville is a
spot
place
here.
to visit. Out of 195 communities that asked that same question in recent years on the survey, McMinnville ranked 53rd overall.
Okay, great.
So
and I'll
definitely.
echo my other economic development colleagues in the sense that the data seems very spot on from what we can assess anecdotally, and I'm really excited to see how we implement this into a greater strategy for the city overall for economic development. So, thank you.
That's great. We always hope there aren't surprises in the data. It should be overall what your perception is, but it's great when it can be backed up with a scientific study of a random sample of residents. It's not just the key stakeholders or the folks that are really involved in the community or showing up at meetings all of the time. This is a truly random cross section of residents. So it's great that it's really in line with what you all are already working on and focused on at the city.
Yeah, more data the better. Thank you.
thank you, Jeff. What I'm going to do now is go around to staff and see if you might have specific questions as it depends to your area of management. And so, Heather, I hate to put you on the spot first, but any questions that you might have as it relates to the survey?
Yeah, so this is Heather Richards. I'm the planning director for the city. I had a couple of questions. One is relative to the quality of life markers that are at the higher subsets. So McMinnville scores at a similar level to national benchmarks. Do you have a lot of communities that are scoring at a higher level to national benchmarks in many of those subsets?
We do have some. There are some high-performing communities where you would see, more variety there, and also the flip side, where items overall would be lower than the benchmark. While we have made it difficult to be higher or lower, it's definitely not impossible. And if there were specific ratings, related to planning or the larger facets, and you wanted to know, who some of those top performers were, if that would be helpful to you,
Yeah, I guess
we can
I
potentially
framed the
do
question
some
the
of that
wrong way.
analysis.
It's not the subsets that I'm looking at, it's the larger categories: safety, mobility, natural environment, built environment. Because I'm assuming you have to score high in many of the subsets to get high in that broader category.
Exactly. You'd have to be higher than the benchmark in a majority of those items that fall into each of those overall facets.
Okay. And then if there was
So
one that
we do see it. It's not, it's more common that folks are overall similar, but it is possible, and we do see it.
And then if there's one where we were interested in finding out who the high-performing communities were, so we could look at some best practices from them, can we get that from you?
Yeah, we'd be happy to do some additional analysis, and then we would just want to check in with those communities before giving you any contact information, because it is our policy to keep our clients' data confidential, even when it's good news.
Okay.
But usually people are happy to give us their blessing to give contact information when it's something like that. So
Okay.
yeah, we could definitely look into that.
And
for
then
you.
on the selfish side, going into the subset, so planning scores at a similar level, but it's a pretty low percentage, 49%. So are you finding across your communities that the citizens are just putting it there in the middle in terms of their satisfaction level?
Yes, that tends to be a rating that doesn't get very high ratings from residents. So, while it's, around that 50% mark, it's still similar to the benchmark, because overall that just tends to be a service that honestly most residents don't know a whole lot about also. One of the other options in that excellent, good, fair, poor scale is don't know. And we could look at the percent that said don't know for McMinnville, but that tends to be a service that has a pretty high percentage of respondents also saying don't know. But I believe that rating also went up from 2011 to 2016. So I think there is, reason to celebrate it. And I would definitely consider that a strong rating, even though it's not, 80% or 90% excellent plus good. That's why those benchmarks can be so helpful, because there's always going to be certain kinds of ratings that garner higher ratings from residents than others, and it doesn't mean that one department is doing a better or worse job. It's a perception issue.
Okay, thank you. That's all I had, Mayor.
Thank you, Heather. Mike? I see transportation was, again, one of the top areas that people are willing to support, but
Thank you, Mayor. This is Mike Bissett, the Community Development Director, City Engineer. So you spoke a little bit about telling our story. I think that particular issue is a matter of timing. As you know, we passed the transportation bond, which is a significant investment in the transportation network, in late 2014. It took a while to sell bonds, and then it took a while to start to do projects. And in fact, we had had very little progress towards the bond measure projects by the time the survey was issued. And so I would fully expect by 2021, when we've done another survey and we've completed all of these transportation improvements, that we'll continue to trend upward in the transportation network questions. And in fact, my recollection was the street maintenance activity actually trended higher between 2011 and 2016. So I really didn't have any questions and really didn't see any surprises when it came to the infrastructure part of the survey.
thank you, Mike. Jay, from Parks, any questions that you saw that is relevant to your area?
So she can't see me, so my name is Jay Pearson. I'm the Park and Recreation Director. I think the use of our park system retained a pretty strong rating, pretty favorable rating in the eyes of the community. I think we're just a couple percentage points down this go around as opposed to the first one for use. I think 87 or 89 to 85, maybe, or 89 to 87. It's still very high, and pleased to see that. In reading the results of perception on the community center, I think the aquatic center, they suggested some concern. I think it still rates pretty well, but I think there was some indication that perhaps the perception is that the centers aren't working for the community as they have in the past. That's kind of my read on it. But I did go and spend time with the anecdotal statements that were sort of open-ended that may provide some clues to the reason for that. I tend to think that availability, because of the expanded programs that we're offering, perhaps is less flexible. I think condition of facilities might suggest that we're aging a little bit, and people are noticing that now too, and hopefully over the next couple of years we'll be able to come down and do some painting and some improvements that way. Unless there was something in the anecdotal comments about community center, aquatic center that you might recall, I don't really have any questions right now, but we need to take a second read and spend some time with that, and then maybe begin asking our day-to-day patrons what they're observing so we can respond to that.
Dama, any comments to anything that Jay just had mentioned from your perspective?
I think there were some comments in the report that did have to do with that, but not off the top of my head. But I'd be happy to take a closer look at some of that data and give you my read on it. I can follow up with you.
Thank you. Chief, Rich, anything from a fire perspective?
Nothing from the fire perspective, but a question for Dana on the process that was used this year comparatively to 5 years ago. They incorporated a web-based survey also, and I was curious. I know the written survey or the hard copy was what was used for the report, but did the web-based survey trend any differently than the hard copied survey?
So we did incorporate some of the web responses, into the data, and we did do some investigation to see if those responses differed, and overall they did not. And because those households that were invited to complete the survey via the scientific sample were also given that link, typically we don't see a big variety there, but we did take a look at that, and those web responses were incorporated into the results.
Okay, thank you.
Okay. Chief, Matt, any thoughts from your perspective?
No, just want to echo that the data that came out, it was not surprising. I think some of the main themes that your survey hit on reference downtown safety, and then obviously some gang issues. Those were, I think, trending at the time within our city. I'm kind of curious, though, where we landed, and I'm sorry, I did not recently take a look. I looked at a number a couple months ago, maybe when it was initially handed out. Where are we sitting benchmark-wise with respect to satisfaction with the police services? That's something I would be curious about. And additionally, like Heather said, I'd be curious to see those that are above benchmark, that are doing some exceptional things. I'd be really interested to see or be provided with that information, that I might be able to reach out to similar sized communities that are doing a good job and I guess doing things differently, So I like stealing ideas. That's
Sure,
all.
and we can check into that for you. I mean, overall, I believe that overall ratings for the police department, I believe, were similar to the benchmark, and most safety ratings were as well. But if you're interested in if identifying some communities of similar size that had higher ratings for police services, I'd be happy to look into that for you.
Yeah, and Rich and I, the fire chief, were just talking about, we rated a little lower on the, what was it? It was outreach, community outreach? Prevention outreach, that sort of stuff.
Outreach, yeah.
And that, again, Rich and I just shot a comment back and forth that does not surprise us. And when you're a little leaner, that those are the first areas of outreach or a capacity that you lose is that outreach. So that was just anecdotally, that's right on the mark probably too. That's all.
And that, I believe, we saw some comments in the open-ended report that said things along the lines of people would like to see more police on the streets. So sometimes perceptions of safety can go down even if crime is not increasing. If it's, especially if it's been publicized a lot in the media around when the data is being collected, if there's talk about cuts in the police force or anything like that, that can definitely have an impact on resident perception.
Let's move to Scott. I know, IT services is more of an internal thing, but we saw, that people are utilizing our website as a way of gathering information. Anything that you might want to ask or any questions you might have, Scott?
Yeah, I was glad to see where the website was right up there as a source of information with local news and, other things that you would know where people are getting information from. So we know people are looking at it. I'd be curious to know if this survey in the future, or maybe the data's buried in there a little bit, because I haven't done too far into it either. If there are going to be any other questions that might be a little bit more granular about citizens and electronic services, because there's a lot of things in their categories are grouped as services, and it's pretty broad. And it, it could be anything from patching a street to paying something online, just as people are getting into more and more digital services, if that would be broken out a little bit. So just something maybe for 2021.
And I think we would have the option, I think we added 5 questions that we picked out, and you might, as a department, think of that one question, maybe that might be a burning question when it comes to electronic, and we could include that. We kind of want to follow historically some of the same questions because it's very unique to McMinnville, but I would leave the door open that we might be able to be thinking about, if we had that one question, what that might be to address your concern. Okay.
Can I ask another question?
Sure.
On this, one of the slides, there was shopping, I believe, was one of the important areas. And when I read through the data, I wanted to say that I saw Costco mentioned a lot. Am I right about that?
In the open-ended report, the folks might have been talking about that.
So
Yeah.
the question is that a trend across the country that everybody wants big box stores at Costco? Or is that just something because nobody wants to drive to Corvallis or
Well, this was one of the questions that was completely unique to McMinnville, and when we ask an open-ended question like this, the responses, when folks have the opportunity to write in their own response, that can really vary from community to community. Certainly, some communities, if you asked a question, targeted about that, they might specifically say no big box stores. But it was apparent that one of the rating for shopping opportunities on the survey was lower than the national benchmark. And so maybe what they're echoing in the open-ended responses is that that's what they mean by shopping opportunities, because they gave great ratings to McMinnville having a vibrant downtown and as being a great place to visit, but perhaps as a resident, they do want to see, some of those more convenience kinds of stores, one-stop shopping kinds of places closer to home. That I think that would probably be a pretty good interpretation of how that's echoing the lower ratings for shopping opportunities.
Thank you.
Could I add there that I think that there's, in terms of that specific commentary about Costco, there's been a murmur for many years that, is McMinnville going to get a Costco? And so I would also wonder if that influenced that specific commentary, that maybe it's not as much of a desire or that it's not reflective of a desire of a certain type of store, but that there's a rumored store coming, and if you want more shopping opportunities already, that would naturally fill in there.
I guess it would be helpful to know what kind of shopping opportunities, maybe more specific, because when businesses come to the chamber and they say, we would like to do something, what businesses are needed, if that happens, when that happens, it would be nice to be able to say, this is what our community is asking for, so that, we can help in that, facilitate in that process, and make those things happen for our community and for the businesses.
Well, I get a lot of feedback on that specific question from a vast array of citizens, especially when people have young children. They don't feel as though they have a lot of options for, they can't buy a stroller in McMinnville, or the only place to buy a stroller would be Walmart maybe, so there's not a lot of options. And I see that more so than anything else, people don't really complain about grocery shopping options to me or anything like that, but people specifically talk about needing to find a specific need or a new set of towels or something like homewares, those types of that. I don't know why people tell
And
me
this
that.
isn't necessarily unusual. The original survey that we had done with these folks had even more Costco lists than this particular one.
And we get, I get approached quite a bit that people think it's the city that's holding us back from having a Costco in town. Because that's their perception, is that they want to be here and we've said no. And so we have to tell the story, and I know that I address that maybe once or twice a month as I'm talking to individuals. And I'm guessing some of the other counselors get that also. Melissa, any thoughts from your perspective? Anything that you'd like to ask? Okay, David?
My only one comment on this, I think, is we're looking at how we revamp the community grant program, and we're looking at identifying how different nonprofits and groups can support the council's goals. One of the areas that we're looking at as well is what are the community needs out there, and how do we meet some public interest, and I think that some of the key takeaways from this will help inform that process as well.
Definitely.
To understand what is it that what are the gaps out there or the priorities out there that the community has as well that we can
Yeah,
target.
just as part of a comment on that, when we discussed this in optional questions, we deliberately kind of stayed away from affordable housing at the time. And it popped up as like 25% interest in it, which was rather significant in my mind. It definitely is something that people are talking about, thinking about, and concerned about.
Yeah, because we were just starting to put our thoughts and some action around affordable housing, and I don't know that we thought we were prepared yet.
We weren't quite prepared yet, and we weren't really sure what the overall public perception was of it. And so it was interesting to see these results.
So it is wise to see that that's come up on its own.
Yeah.
From that perspective. Jeff, I'm going to hold off for a moment for you so you can continue to think. Remy, I'm going to go down to you and see if you may have some questions or thoughts.
I don't have time, thank you.
Okay. Wendy?
I have a question that's a data collection question. I know that on another survey that we were looking at, there was a little bit of a bias in it, in that the demographic that tended to fill out the survey was an older demographic, so we felt like we weren't capturing a certain demographic of people. How do you adjust for that in your surveys to make sure that we're getting across demographics?
Yeah, that's a great question, and it is something that we do address in the data analysis. McMinnville's not alone there. We typically see certain kinds of demographics over-respond to this kind of survey, and certain kinds of demographics under-respond. We do typically hear from more older adults than younger adults, more homeowners than renters, and so forth. And so what we do is we look at the most recent census data available for McMinnville. We look at the raw data from the survey and see how people responded to those demographic questions on the survey. And then we apply some weights to the data. We use a program called SPSS that is able to apply individual weights to each record on the survey. And we want to make sure that we're making these adjustments wisely and cautiously, and we're never, overinflating one survey too much or turning one down too much, but it helps us get a more representative overall picture of the community as a whole. And there's some more detail about that in the technical appendices report. And there's a weighting, what we call a weighting table, that shows you the census norms we used for McMinnville compared to the raw data, and then how that looked once we applied those statistical adjustments. And all of the data that you see in the reports has had those weights applied to it.
Okay, great. And I guess the other, this might be more of a comment, but I'd welcome your thoughts on this, is as I was reading this, some of, particularly looking at Table 1 in the trends one, That's on page 3. It talks about community characteristics general. And when you go down the list and you look at the percentages, and for 2011, 2016, and then the comparison benchmarks, I noticed that in 2011, we have similar, much higher, higher, lower, higher, much higher, much higher, and then we're all similar in 2016, which for me makes me think some of this data is because of national changes that, like, for example, with the economy question and people feeling positively about the economy. It may not be because of changes we've made. How do you have any response to that with regards to how we can see what things are specific to McMinnville, what changes are specific to McMinnville and looking at the data?
Yes, that's an excellent observation, and I'm so glad that you looked at the reports so thoroughly. And a lot of that has to do, some of it has to do with overall perceptions changing over time, since it has been 5 years since your last survey. And there can be a shift in some of those things nationally over time. However, most of those changes are more due to our own emerging and changing methodologies. So I talked a little bit earlier about how we've intentionally made it really difficult to be higher than or lower than the benchmark. We've widened that band we put around the benchmark since McMinnville's 2011 survey. We made this methodology switch probably in 2013 or 2014. So if we were to compare your 2011 data using the same parameters to the benchmark, you'd see more of those similars as you did in the 2016 data. So in a sense, we're using sort of a different yardstick there. So if you compare the benchmarks over time, it's not the most, it's not an apples to apples comparison that way. So that should really probably account for most of those differences.
Okay, good. That's very helpful. Thank you.
Council President Menke. Kelly, questions?
When I looked at this, I found the results rather interesting. I think that probably the one that surprised me the most was the comments on the transportation, but what Mike said earlier makes sense, that people really haven't seen big results yet from that, and they're going to within the next couple of years. That and then the emphasis on the affordable housing and the homelessness I thought were very significant. So I thought it was very interesting. I don't have any particular data questions. I remember quite a bit of this from the first go-around.
Thank you, Kelly. Jeff, from your perspective, you've probably been through some of these types of similar exercises with surveys. Jeff has been our city manager for a little over a month now.
A month to the day.
A month to the day. But he brings a lot of experience and to the table.
So 1 month anniversary from the council's action. So I appreciate the work, and I do think, as many have said, it's going to help inform a lot of the work we do, and in some cases affirms the directions that the community is going. In terms of the benchmarking, have you or are you able to review the benchmarks on a more regional basis, like the Pacific Northwest, for instance, as opposed to a national benchmark? And does our relative position in that geographic market change very much when you look at a regional assessment?
Good questions. We absolutely can do that kind of custom benchmark analysis where we're comparing you only to other jurisdictions in the Pacific Northwest or only those of similar size. We've done for other communities, we can do resort community benchmarks, we can do university community benchmarks. So there's a lot of different ways we can create subsets of some of jurisdictions that might be more your peers are facing some of the same more specific challenges. And so that's an add-on option we offer. It's a really popular one. It's another way to look at the data. But overall, if you're already at the top of that list nationally, you should stay, pretty competitive. And if you're, lower than the benchmark in an area and pretty towards, the lower bottom of the barrel there, you wouldn't change that necessarily. But it can be another helpful way to look at it. Some communities we work with say, thanks for the national benchmarks, they're great, but what really matters to us and the way that we, want to see how we stack up is to other communities with, average annual incomes in this range, or those of a similar size, or those in our region. And so it kind of depends on what's going to be most useful and helpful to you, but we absolutely have that capability to do that with the data, if that's something you'd like us to do.
Thank you.
A question that I had is, I know as we were putting this together, a real desire to be more successful in our responses from the Latino and the Spanish, and we went ahead and had a Spanish version. Can you share with us, did we have more responses in 2016 than in 2011, and I know we didn't do it in Spanish in 11, but some sense, did we have a greater reach this time from your perspective than in times past?
I'll have to take a look at the 2016 raw data to see if we, got more responses from folks that identified as Hispanic than we did in 2016. Certainly offering the survey in Spanish and having communications about the survey be in both English and Spanish to all the households that receive the mailings is a great way to be a more accessible community. And I think it's definitely important in a community that has a high number of Spanish-speaking households. Unfortunately, I think we only got a couple of Spanish surveys completed, in Spanish, and it's not uncommon. It's really, really difficult with any community we work with to get non-English speakers to complete this kind of survey. I think it's important to have them available and accessible. We've done some different things in our methodology to try and keep the cost as low as we can, because we realize the ROI isn't high, but it's still important for communities to be accessible to non-English speakers. I think there's potentially some cultural barriers, in addition to the language barrier, that come into play with that sort of thing, and folks maybe think they're being, tracked or counted, even though it's an anonymous survey. But I can take a look and see if we saw any shifts in the raw demographics from 2011 to 2016 to see if that came into play.
I think as a continuation of the mayor's question, that I remember when we were setting this up that we saw a pretty low response rate from the Latino community compared to the overall community of McMinnville, and of those who identify as either Latino or Hispanic. And so it would be a really interesting to know not just how many surveys were returned in Spanish, which would be interesting as well, but if we were actually able to make those numbers correlate more with our community demographics. Yeah.
And I'm thinking it's probably pretty hard because we don't know what demographic we send it to, because it's such a random picking.
It's not, isn't there a there's a personal question at the beginning. Yeah. But I'm just saying the surveys we send out aren't based on certain areas. It's a complete random sending out, and right.
so. But I know that was a real design on our part to reach out and be hopefully gathering more to the demographics that really make up our community.
Are you doing anything that would focus it better than what we were doing? Because I think we sent out English ones and said, if you want Spanish, just ask for it. Is there something else that you folks would recommend or try in the future?
Well, the way we do it actually is that, so that's each household receives 3 mailings. And the first mailing is a pre-notification postcard letting folks know that their household's been selected and that it's very important that they complete the survey. Those postcards had English and Spanish side by side, paragraph of each. And then the next mailing is the survey packet with the postage paid return envelope. The survey itself is in English, but the instructions on the cover letter that accompanies it are in both English and Spanish, again, a half and half split. And the English instructions say, complete this survey or complete it online if you prefer. The difference with the Spanish instructions is that it asks folks to go online to complete the survey. So we found that's a more cost-effective approach than mailing. If we were to mail, for instance, surveys in both English and Spanish, it would pretty much double the hard costs for the project, and it still doesn't have a great ROI. We have had communities that have done that, and it still hasn't yielded that many responses, even when we do that. We have done the other approach of just having a phone number for folks to call and request a paper survey in Spanish. That actually cost more than offering it online. So again, that return on investment was even lower. It also made survey recipients have to take that extra step and make a personal contact to try and get a survey, which could be a deterrent. And studies show that most Spanish-speaking households do have access to smartphones, and the survey can be completed easily on a smartphone. So that's why the reasons why we made that switch, that if you choose our standard Spanish language option, it's an online option. Then that third mailing that all the households receive is pretty much identical to that first survey packet. Just the language in the cover letters is a little different, saying if you've already completed it, go ahead and discard. But that's just a best practice in survey research in methodology, to have that multi-contact to try and address non-response bias as much as we can.
Any other questions that anyone has come up with since you had your opportunity? I guess our next question is, what do we do next so that we have our marching orders?
That's a great question, and probably one of the most important ones. I have a list here of some things that I want to follow up on, some notes I've been taking as we've been talking. So I will follow up with Melissa. We have put together some toolkits that I outline some best practices, and also some specific steps other communities have taken with their survey results. We've put together some case studies, and we have a lot of tools like that on our website. So I'll make sure Melissa has links to that she can share with you. And some of that is password protected content, but I'll make sure she's got all of that. But I think everything that I've been hearing from you today is that most of this is not a surprise and is kind of in line with a lot of what you're already doing. And so I think, that's always a positive thing to hear. And, as we if you get a chance to look deeper into the data, if you have more questions for us or decide you want us to do some other additional kinds of analyses, we're happy to do that. We can do, custom targeted surveys in off years between administrations of the National Citizen Survey. If you wanted to dig deeper into some of those questions about what kinds of businesses do residents really want to see in town, what would they support, what should the city be actively trying to recruit, we can help you with that sort of thing. We have a business survey that can be really helpful for chambers of commerce as well. Somebody mentioned some of the internal services like IT. We also do an employee survey. So there's lots of other kinds of work we can do for you if you want to go into any of those directions into more detail as well.
Well, if no other questions, thank you. I think this is, we've been with you for two sessions, and I think we had one before, so we have become pretty accustomed to this survey. And the thought that I have in closing is to take the time to look at the data, and then to bring it up as we're talking and telling the story. I mean, I can tell you the success of our transportation bond. We really use the citizen survey, community survey, to help us tell the story that people in this community were willing to increase their taxes to have better roads and more functionality in our transportation plan. I think right now, when we're looking at affordable housing and we're looking at homelessness, it just goes to the point that we are moving down a path that our citizens want us to do. The addition of some officers, I think it solidifies that. I think we listen really good in this community, but it's great to get the data, the technical piece that says that our listening ears are really attuned to what's out and about, as compared to having rose-colored glasses and blinders on that keep us from really addressing that which we need. So from my perspective, I think it's well worth the time, the money, and the effort that's been placed forward. But it's incumbent upon each and every one of us to take this data now and to incorporate that into our priorities, our planning, and the direction we have. So thank you all for coming out, and I think it was well worth to have our partners. So partners, thank you for being here. I hope it was well worth your time, and again, we're willing to share any and all of the information, so just let us know. So thanks everyone, and thanks for the opportunity to have this time to meet today. Thanks all.
Thank you all. Thanks so much.
Oh, no, I think it was great.